Soldiers speak out. We can tell the truth of what we've seen. We are not liars. Soldiers speak out. We have a duty to all children and to their futures. Soldiers speak out.
Welcome to the Veterans Hour, a monthly program produced by the Rachel Corrie Chapter 109 Veterans for Peace in Olympia. I am Mark Fleming, your host for this month's program. Veterans for Peace is a global organization of military veterans and allies whose collective efforts build a culture of peace by using our experiences and lifting our voices. We inform the public of the true causes of war and the enormous cost of wars, with an obligation to heal the wounds of wars. The Rachel Corrie Chapter in Olympia is one of over 140 chapters worldwide whose work includes educating the public, advocating for dismantling of the war economy, providing services that assist veterans and victims of war, and most significantly, working to end all wars. Each month we present a program focusing on veterans affairs, and issues of war and peace. This month's program examines issues related to the development and use of nuclear weapons in the 21st century. I'm very pleased to have as my guests two activists in the nuclear resistance movement in Washington. Larry Kerschner, a member of the Rachel Corrie Chapter, and Bernie Meyer, a well-known activist and interpreter of Mohandas Gandhi. So welcome, Larry, and welcome, Bernie. I really appreciate you coming in today. And one of the reasons I asked Larry and Bernie to come in is because they recently were convicted of trespass at the naval base Bangor, the submarine base, because they went in to protest on Mother's Day of 2016. Is that correct? Mm-hmm. So Bernie, why don't you start out and tell us what you did on Mother's Day of 2016? And
I'm part of the Ground Zero Center for Nonviolent Action in Bangor, and I'm utterly concerned about nuclear weapons and nuclear war, especially now, more than ever. The danger is greater than during the Cold War. So being part of Ground Zero Center, which is a piece of property that a few of us have owned for the last 39 years, adjoining Subbase Bangor up on the Hood Canal. Subbase Bangor is where the Trident submarine is, and the mission of Ground Zero Center is to eliminate the Trident nuclear weapons system. It's a first strike weapon, and it's been up there since I moved here in 1978 in the state of Washington. So we 3 times a year have actions there, and some people risk arrest. And last Mother's Day in 2016, 3 of us risked arrest by blocking the road on the federal side of the line. In other words, there's federal side going to the base and state property and road going away from the base, and we went across the federal and were immediately arrested for trespassing. The 3 of us were arrested. And why? Because we're in utter danger. And my basic thing is we humans are doing ourselves in not just through nuclear weapons, but through the climate and our wasting of the planet Earth. And so that was my statement to the government, to the decision makers, but also to the American people, because if the American people and the people around the world don't wake up, we could all be gone sometime, who knows, sooner or later.
And I know, Larry, in your statement, you also brought up the issue of, I think it's called civil resistance,
right,
as opposed to civil disobedience.
Right.
So that was another factor. So tell us about that.
Well, the difference between civil disobedience and civil resistance is in civil disobedience, it's a subtle difference, but in civil disobedience, you're breaking a law yourself in order to make a political point. Civil resistance, you're basically recognizing and pointing out where someone else is breaking the law, and in this case, it's the United States government breaking the law related to nuclear weapons. I mean, in my statement to the court, I basically asked the court to identify the current U.S. nuclear policy as an ongoing criminal conspiracy by the executive branch of the United States government. Needless to say, they didn't follow that, but I mean, that was one of the reasons that I was there. I mean, if you look at the international laws related to nuclear weapons and war, you know, the genocide conventions, Nuremberg principles, the UN Charter. There's a number of these charters, and all of those the United States Congress has approved and have become part. You know, we've signed on to those treaties, and under the United States Constitution, Article 6, Clause 2 says that treaties are the supreme law of the United States. So all of those laws should supersede local and municipal laws. But during our trial, they basically didn't allow us to have a fair trial because they didn't allow us to bring any necessity defense or international law into the discussion in order to explain why we were doing what we were doing. They basically wanted to focus narrowly on the question of, did you step across the line or not?
Which was
not,
obvious. Not a dispute.
We didn't dispute that. So, but in not allowing us to have a fair trial, it's, you know, it's another way in which the United States government isn't following the Constitution. I mean, freedom of speech should at the very least allow us to have our say in court when we're in court.
But you could not bring that up.
But we couldn't bring up any of
And
those.
I think you had also brought up, or was it you, Bernie, about the Nuremberg principle, that just because, you know, we established the principle that people, if they don't resist, are responsible. So this is one way of...
Right. Robert Jackson, who was the primary U.S. prosecutor during the Nuremberg trials after the Second World War, he later became a Supreme Court justice. He said that international law is binding on citizens the same as municipal and domestic law, and that came out of the Nuremberg trials because at that time they were many of the Nazis were trying to say that they did what they did because they were ordered to do it, and it was clear that the outcome of the Nuremberg trials was that when you commit a crime, even if you were ordered to do it, you're responsible for what you did. And so the U.S. Government basically is responsible for this ongoing criminal conspiracy that we're all involved in. And the judicial branch is also complicit in this ongoing crime because they allow the executive branch to say and do anything they want if they, you know, in the foreign policy. So it's a ongoing conspiracy of the whole government.
So in a sense, it's making us all complicit because
Exactly.
this is our government, our tax dollars going into this illegal activity.
And essentially, anyone who doesn't make a statement pointing this out is a collaborator for criminal activity. So the vast majority of the American public are collaborators of an ongoing crime, and it's mostly through what I call willful ignorance. Most of the American public don't want to hear what we have to say because if they listen to it and realize the implications of it, they would have to do something in their lives. And we're all very comfortable in our lives and don't want to make those changes.
And that's what the action that you all did, bring it to attention, as well as this whole issue of resisting. Because you don't have to be arrested to resist.
No.
And we'll talk a little bit about some of that as we go through it. I think, Bernie, you had mentioned too just the threat of nuclear weapons, and I think there's a sense that nuclear weapons aren't a threat now because, you know, the Soviet Union is gone, the Cold War is over. So why, you know, what's going on now that makes it a threat? And you said it's even more so than the Cold War.
Even more so, and people like William Perry, who's former Secretary of Defense, is at 89 years of age, starting up to say, wake up, people. You don't know what's going on. He's terrified. He uses that word. He's terrified. He says we're in a more dangerous situation now than during the Cold War. And there's lots of reasons for that. We made statements in connection with the trial. I made a statement, as I mentioned before, about global climate change and nuclear weapons. That was at the time of the action, but as the time of the trial, a year later in April, when we were tried, I did another statement, quoting people like Perry and other insiders, saying we're sliding into nuclear war and grave danger of that. And so why? Well, there's lots of reasons depending on who's talking or who's thinking, but basically we have a posture. And some of my sources here, I brought this to show a few of the books of sources to say there's a lot of information. And this book goes back to the Truman Doctrine, which after World War II, President Truman put us into the posture which said that through the words of George Kennan with the Department of the Secretary with the Department of State, that America has 5% of the world population consuming 45% of the world's goods. The world isn't going to tolerate that, so we got to
Build a wall of some sort, a nuclear wall.
Well, you didn't use the word wall, but we got to maintain the power. And it's not a time to play around with being kind and good to other people. He uses that kind of language. And after the Cold War happened, the Cold War ended in 1991. A couple years later, the Project for a New American Century made the doctrine that we will not allow another power like the former Soviet Union to rise up to be a threat. And so that posture continues to today. In our weaponry, we've got to get into talking about what we're doing with nuclear weapons. It's not just, we didn't phase out like a lot of people, including peace advocates, peace activists, thought, well, we'll get rid of nuclear weapons now that the Cold War is over. It's not the case.
Yeah. And actually, one thing I would point out, Gilberto Perez, the third member of the Trident Three, had a quote from former Admiral William Leahy, who was Chief of Staff to President Eisenhower, that said, "In being the first to use nuclear weapons, we adopted an ethical standard common to barbarians of the Dark Ages."
Right.
So that says something about what kind, even they understood back then.
And I think that most people think of the nuclear weapon as being a military thing. But in fact, even the first, the United States being the only country that's used nuclear weapons on other people, even those first two were essentially more political than military, because the Soviet Union had just come into the war at the end, and Truman and his cronies wanted to show our power to the Soviet Union to keep them under control. They wanted to test the difference between a uranium bomb and a plutonium bomb. So those were basically political decisions, because it wasn't necessary militarily to win the war.
I mean, those weren't military targets.
Exactly. And in that thinking, every single nuclear weapon that has been built and or tested, over 2,000 nuclear explosions to test these weapons since then, they've all been political statements, basically. They're not military. There aren't any, I shouldn't say there aren't any, but there aren't many people who are in the military who would even consider the use of a nuclear weapon, because they're so devastating. So it's all political. It isn't military.
Yeah. And now we're in the process of modernizing our system.
Right.
So you said, the Cold War is over, yet we are going to be spending close to $1 trillion over 30 years
Right.
to modernize our system. So what is it we're doing that is making it so much more risky now than during the Cold War?
Well, one of the things that has happened recently is there's a few called a fuse, F-U-Z-E, in the missiles that have to do with how accurate they are. And they've recently developed a superfuse that made them 3 times more accurate than they used to be. So if you're trying to pretend in your fantasy world that nuclear weapons are somehow usable, and the military tries to say that they use the least amount of force, and so they're not going to kill civilians and collateral damage. So if you've got a weapon that is 3 times more accurate than it used to be, you're more likely to use it. So that's one of the things that has happened recently.
Another one is the fact that they have smaller nukes now. The nukes on the Trident submarine are, 460 kilotons of power. It can just devastate the whole city of Seattle, one bomb.
Yeah.
And so they have these huge weapons, and they put the superfuse on those, and so that can get to the bunkers and underground targets, that including nuclear weapons in other countries.
Targeting their nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Right.
So that would give them an incentive to think, maybe we need to fire them now.
But now they've developed mini nukes and are saying, well, the collateral damage is minimal. It's a lie. It's not true. And they can be dialed from 10 kilotons to 5 times the Hiroshima bomb, 60 to 70
So how large was
kilotons.
the Hiroshima bomb?
I think it was
15.
around
15.
Yeah, 15,
Yeah.
and killed 100,000 people roughly.
And you see the pictures of the devastation.
Right.
That's why I think minimal collateral damage, I mean, you're thinking in like miles and miles as opposed to
And
meters.
now the military, or not the military, but those in charge thinking is 100,000 people is an acceptable collateral damage. I mean, what does that say about the United States?
It says they're really not worth considering.
Yeah.
Well,
And-
it says about the military and those people that know that. How many American people know this kind
Exactly.
of information?
The
Well, I
media
think-
doesn't put this information
And as you
out.
mentioned, the Cold War is over, so we can untarget our missiles. And they really have changed. I mean, the number of warheads has gone down, but as you say, they're becoming more accurate,
Right.
more deadly. So even though they're fewer, and the image I always use is 2 guys standing in a room full of gasoline, and one says, "I have 5 matches, and you only have 3, so I'm more powerful."
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
It doesn't take too many, and that we talk about the U.S. and Russia, the major ones, but then you've got smaller countries like India and Pakistan, and
Right.
have been to war 3 times over the past,
Since 1947 independence.
and now they're both nuclear armed.
Right.
And now they're both nuclearized, and they both have mini nukes too.
Yeah.
And the tests have been done about the effect on climate. If they have an exchange between those 2 countries, each country has at least 100 nuclear weapons. If they have an exchange, the refuse that goes up in the air will block the sunlight around the world. And the estimates are 1 to 2 billion people will die just
Yeah.
from that exchange.
That's just from a small nuclear war,
Right.
so
Yeah.
to speak.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's 100 nukes they're talking about for the nuclear winter, but up here at Trident, they have 1,300 nuclear weapons right there.
On the various subs.
It's estimated, the most nuclear weapons.
Right, 20 miles west of Seattle.
Yeah, right.
Because like the Trident base is the Pacific base for the nuclear fleet.
Right.
There's one in Georgia, I think.
Right, Kings Bay, Georgia.
And I know that the Trident, each Trident sub carries like 28 missiles.
They've got
24.
24 silos, and each silo is basically designed to carry up to 8 independently targetable.
So one missile can
But they
send out-
actually have done testing, and each of those can actually carry 12 nuclear. But if you stick to the 8, you've got over 100 nuclear weapons on each submarine. And because they're under the water and they're hidden, there's no defense to stop, so they're a first strike weapon.
Right.
I mean, and people don't think about that.
I mean, they're far more secure than, say, the silo missiles in Nebraska or
Right.
the B-52s.
Right. The United States military posture, including space, is what they call total spectrum dominance. So we've got all these satellites up there that if another country were to shoot a missile at us, we're going to know the instant it leaves the ground. The Soviet Union doesn't have that, or not Russia, I guess, not the Soviet Union, but Russia doesn't have that kind of satellite system. They have ground-based radar. So they have to wait until the missile comes over the horizon before they know it's coming. So that puts them in the posture of having to react instantly. At least the United States, if they see something coming, they're going to have more time, at least 15 or 20 more minutes to react than the Russians would.
To make sure that it's a real missile.
Exactly. So, and there have been instances in which there have been accidents, and I think in Finland, a weather balloon or something went up, and the Russians thought that it was a missile coming because it just came right up, and they almost responded with nuclear weapons against the United States because they don't know when it's coming.
I know there was a nuclear submarine commander, Russian, who did not follow orders.
Right.
That was during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Cuban Missile Crisis, yeah.
There's been several of these things, and Eric Schlosser has done a movie as well as a book called Command and Control. You can see this type of information. This information is available. The question is, how do we get this out? How do people wake up and pay attention?
Right.
Yeah. Well, in the past, people have. I mean, you've seen it, various times when there has been efforts, protests. You going all the way back to the beginning of the bomb. There was the Committee for Nuclear Disarmament in Britain, banned the bomb here in the U.S. So there has always been some movement, but it's been sporadic. And I guess during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we all got a wake-up call. And during Ronald Reagan's administration, when he started wanting to put nuclear missiles in Europe, I think, that led to the nuclear freeze movement. And ultimately, Ronald Reagan ended up negotiating a nuclear arms limitation treaty. But there's always been some concern, but it seems sporadic. And these days, it seems pretty moribund.
Right. It was much more in the common consciousness during the 80s than it is now. We were talking earlier, there was one Central Park gathering in New York City of 1 million people protesting nuclear weapons.
And that was part of a nationwide where you had thousands of people around the country.
Right. When Ground Zero started opposing the base there at Bangor, there were tens of thousands of people there.
Live without Trident. But I need to point out, we're saying people don't know about it, and if they did, there's been, surveys, and a lot of people are against nuclear weapons, but they're ignorant. And this author, Mikhail Chozhdowski, with Global Research, points out the intentional misleading of people that is going on, has been going on for years. Ignorance is being fostered. You heard about manufacturing consent, okay? Well, there's very sophisticated. This goes back to Freud's nephew starting public relations and how to move people. But Goebbels knew it's easy to get people behind the war. You just play into their fears. But the propaganda that's being used intentionally to mislead people about what's going on. Peace means war, and war means peace. How do we do
So
this?
what kind of examples of that does he provide? I mean,
well, he goes into several of them, and he starts with 9/11 actually, and that's a tough one because we really got our fear emotions going at that time, and so he advocates examining what happened on 9/11 and what happened as a consequence to the blowing of those buildings and so forth, and the war on terror and what that means. And he says if people got a clear understanding of what happened at 9/11, it wasn't Al-Qaeda as we understand it. The United States government, and he goes into this, started Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan.
Right.
Back when they were freedom fighters.
Back when they were freedom fighters. So that was tied into that. But the consequence is that bin Laden is questionable. There's no evidence about actually how he did it and what he did, and yet people think so. But then the war on terror, and so what is terror and who's the fosterer of terror? It's a pretty deep analysis, and that's where he starts. But then there's examples in what's going on in the Middle East now and so forth, which I just finished reading this second book on the possible scenario of World War III. And I've read this one, The Globalization of War. In my old age, I can't just rattle things off, but
yeah. I mean, it's clear that we have a very militaristic foreign policy, national policy, and a lot of it's, nuclear weapons are some kind of a ground level to it. And I think one of the things the United States has done, the United States has been the leader in the nuclear arms race pretty much throughout my life. I mean, we were the first to develop it. We were racing with Germany, but we went on and used it. We developed the hydrogen bomb, the ICBM, the multiply independently targeted reentry vehicles, and so on. So every time we do that, we have an advantage, which means our adversaries will have to counter that.
Right.
So it's just kind of a spiral.
Right. I mean, more recently, you can look at George Bush's axis of evil.
Mm-hmm. He gets into this.
There was three countries on his axis of evil. Which is the one that we attacked? The one without any nuclear capabilities. Iran may or may not have had, and North Korea didn't take them very long to figure out if they had nukes, they weren't getting attacked by the U.S. So it's that whole.
He gets into all those scenarios.
And we also have the story of Libya as a cautionary tale, because Libya was a pariah state when they were developing nuclear weapons. They came in and gave them up, and within a few years, Gaddafi was out and dead.
Right, exactly.
So Kim Jong-un will look at that and say, I don't want that.
Yeah, and we were talking earlier about the current reasons why we might be headed toward nuclear war. If you look at our shift to the Pacific and directly taking on China, look at all the military bases through NATO that we have surrounding Russia. Mm-hmm. China and Russia, along with North Korea, can't help but feel threatened by us. I mean, we're the only country with somewhere between 800 and 1,000 military bases around the world. We're the only country that has used nuclear weapons on other people.
And if you think back to the Cold War, one of the reasons why we put so much reliance on nuclear weapons was we didn't want to fund a big army in Germany to stop the Soviets. Right. So we said we'll have nukes.
Right. Right.
So we developed that. So that's part of our military doctrine.
And you remember when they developed neutron bombs, which were an interesting variation that would only kill the people, but it wouldn't damage the buildings.
And it's claimed in here that Israel has some neutron bombs.
Yeah.
They have estimated 100 to 200 nuclear weapons. I like to say that a guy like Perry, who's an insider.
And he was a Republican who joined the Clinton administration?
Oh, no.
No, he was the Secretary of Defense under
Bush?
In the 90s.
The Papa Bush, I think.
Yeah. But he goes back to World War II as a soldier, going into Hiroshima and seeing the effects of nuclear weapons. Then he gets into private business, and he's an expert on physics and ran his own business. Then he got into government and worked several positions within government, and his whole life was pretty much dedicated to preventing nuclear war from within the system. And in the 90s, he was Secretary of Defense when the agreement was made to cut back on U.S. and Soviet Union or Russian weapons at that time. And he made friends with Russian people and vice versa, and they had a trust relationship that came because he helped destroy some of the Russian silos and so forth, and they helped destroy some of ours. They chipped back, and that trust relationship is critical. But now it's gone down, and that's why he's terrified. Mm-hmm. He's explaining how the trust has gone down, and with what's going on now between our president's relationship with Russia's president and vice versa, the trust is shattered.
Yeah, and of course Russia feels like it's being surrounded.
And it is.
And China is both feeling it's surrounded, but also trying to assert its what they consider their proper role, which,
right,
if you look at Chinese history, kind of
right,
looks that way to them. So you have this conflict, and they're all armed. I mean, Russia and the U.S. have the bulk of the weapons, but China has enough to create mayhem. Right. In fact, at this point, I just want to show this graphic that we have that shows the estimated global nuclear warhead inventories. And what we're seeing is total inventory for Russia is 7,000. I think that's 6,800 for the U.S., and that's total. Some of those have been retired, but can be brought out of retirement. Right. Some are stockpiled. They are still available, but they're not targeted, and then they're the deployed. So right now, this is showing that the U.S. or Russia has just under 2,000, and the United States has 1,740. Well, again, think about the 3 matches and the 5 matches. How many does it take?
Yeah.
Right.
And then going down, you know, France, China. I mean, down here it looks pretty, you know, this looks like almost nothing. But as we were talking about with India and Pakistan, that almost nothing could take out a large population.
Yeah.
Could change the climate of the Earth, you know, very dramatically and very quickly.
Right.
It would be also instructive to have that kind of a graph about the budget that goes into the militaries. The United States budget surpasses practically half, if not the whole world's military budget. You know,
I think we spend more than in the next 10 countries
Something like
combined,
that,
and
yeah.
about half of those are our allies.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
immensely more.
We're spending around $1 trillion a year on war in one way or another.
And that goes back to what I think Bernie was saying, that the United States has said, we will not allow any other country to come anywhere near us in terms of power. But it doesn't take, they don't need 17 or several thousand warheads, they only need a few.
Right. And I read somewhere, I don't have a source for it, but I read that since 1945, we've spent $17 trillion on nuclear weapons. Just think what the world would be like had we spent $17 trillion on schools and hospitals and clean water and attempts at creating a peaceful world. I mean, $17 trillion is a lot of money.
Right.
we don't have to spend near that much, according to, he retired a couple years ago. He did a budget that 10% of the military budget would eliminate world poverty and all these other problems, just 10%.
And most recently, the U.S. General Accountability Office identified something close to $1 billion worth of arms that had been sent to the Middle East. I forgot what the period was, but they can't account for it. They don't know where it went.
Yeah.
So $1 billion.
Right.
Well,
I mean, not only is that just lost money, but that could be weapons that are going to adversaries. We really don't know. I mean,
well, there's 8.3 trillion that the Defense Department as a whole weren't able to account for.
so I mean, their financial. One of the reasons why the U.S. government does not get a clean financial statement from its accountants is the Pentagon. They cannot account for their systems,
Right.
their money, or their assets. So, and you know, we talked a little bit about some of the doctrine, and we got to go into how it's been. And during the Cold War, we had the MAD, mutually assured destruction, which basically is they fire at us, we're going to kill them.
We've evolved from that, I think. Right now, it almost seems like we're thinking about first strike.
Yeah, that's
It's
been
been a
US.
first strike weapon. That's how Ground Zero started when
Right.
Bob Aldridge, who worked for developing the Trident for the defense industry, he quit because he saw it was a first strike weapon
right.
way back in 1970s. And
It's been the official US policy since 2002, first strike
yeah,
has been official US nuclear policy.
Yeah. And that's when, after 9/11, George
Right.
Bush said all alternatives are on the table, and they said that there are times when we would unilaterally use nuclear weapons.
Right.
They also had, in 2005, as part of this nuclear posture review, a revision of the nuclear doctrine, which established here are the criteria in which the field commanders can ask for nuclear weapons.
Right.
I don't have a list of them all, but basically it came down to when nothing else will work. That was one of them.
Yeah.
And that was the policy from 2005 or 2002 to 2005. And then when it was published, it was leaked to the press, they canceled it. And what that means is they withdrew it from the public view. The policy hasn't changed. So we're still there thinking about how we're going to use these. As we mentioned,
go ahead, finish.
as we mentioned a little bit earlier, it's not just the ICBMs, and it's not Slim Pickens going down with the bomb
Right.
and Dr. Strangelove. These are much more sophisticated weapons. They're still talking about battlefield nuclear weapons.
Right. Tactical nukes.
Yeah. So what are those? I mean,
Who knows what those are?
Yeah.
I mean, they're obviously they're going to be classified. They're not going to tell us, but they essentially are nukes that are more likely to be used.
these
And
would be
it-
smaller.
Smaller, and if you've got the authority for using them at the field level, the commanders in the field, I mean,
Yeah.
that's incredibly frightening to even think about, because there's a lot of people in the military are there to help make it a peaceful world, but there's a lot of people in the military who are there to be macho and to be the top dog, and if you give the access to the nuclear weapons to that guy, I mean, what kind of a dangerous situation is that?
I don't know if you ever saw this T-shirt in Vietnam, which was "Kill them all, let God sort it out."
Right,
That
exactly.
seems to be where we are.
Yeah.
Bernie?
Mentioning these years 2002 to 2005, there was a key meeting in 2003 on the anniversary of Hiroshima, August 6th, in Oakwood military base in Nebraska. That's where the Central Command worldwide is. The United States, right after 9/11, set up these commands in Africa and North South America, the American Command, and Middle East. They got these
Right.
worldwide, so part of the American
Good.
control of the system. But on August 6, 2003, there was a meeting at the Oakwood base with military leaders and leaders of the corporations, the 5 major corporations, Northrop Grumman,
Contractors who build the weapons?
Boeing, and all, yeah. And they co-planned the vision that we're dancing around here.
Plan the actual war, so how they would do
Well,
it.
control. I mean, a lot of people in this country don't realize there is a Northcom, and it's Canada, the U.S., and Mexico, I think, and the 173rd Airborne is attached to that.
Yeah,
And that's in order to control the people in this continent if too many people stand up and say no. I mean, that's there already.
That's there already, and out of this came the loosening up of the command and control system where military leaders in these areas could decide to use nuclear weapons if they thought the situation
Required it, yeah.
required it.
Yeah.
And this is described in these books. And I wish I was technical expert enough to get better at it, but the information's there. It's documented what happens, and how much of this can people take in?
Right.
Yeah, And in fact, in 2010, the Obama administration did a nuclear posture review and came up, they said they would not use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear states that comply with the nuclear proliferation treaty. But of course, that leaves it open to use against nuclear powers. I mean, so it's still there.
Right.
It really didn't change much.
Right.
So
Right.
we're still sitting on, if not first strike, clearly they're there, we will consider to use them. And I think that's the thing that people don't fully understand. I mean,
Yeah.
I hadn't been paying that much attention to it until more recently and thought, that it kind of reminds me of the 80s, back when we saw Reagan ramping up the idea for nuclear war. And if you recall, I mean, we had evacuation plans. I mean,
Right.
we thought something was actually going to happen.
And if you think about a nuclear weapon and try to get your head around it, it's in essence, it's a genocidal weapon. It's so indiscriminate and so vast in its destruction, and then poisoning the area with radiation, which goes on for a long time. I mean, to even think about using such a weapon, I mean, how did the United States come to the point where considering genocide is a reasonable thing
Yeah.
to consider, that it's an acceptable thing
How
to
is it these are
consider.
legitimate weapons?
Exactly,
And that's true just from a reasonable
right,
human standpoint. Even according to international law, a few years ago, I did another one of these actions, and I was emphasizing international humanitarian law,
Right.
which if you apply international humanitarian law to nuclear weapons, it just says nuclear weapons are not a thing to use, just from that standpoint.
Right.
So there's different points of view legally as well as
Right. And that's
morally that you can.
yeah, that's why it was so disgusting that the courts wouldn't let us say that kind of thing in our trial.
It's almost as if you have a dispute with your neighbor, and rather than just going over and killing your neighbor, you take out his entire family and maybe the next few houses too.
Right,
I mean,
right, yeah,
Yeah.
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 I mean, the idea that you can even kill one is bad enough, but all these other people, I mean, none of us are part of the India-Pakistan dispute, at least not directly. So, but we would be affected by it,
Right.
and any other nuclear exchange.
But part of looking at the whole thing is a requirement to look at American history. I mean, this country is based on genocide and racism, and that involves viewing other people as less valuable than you are. And until the American consciousness comes to grips with that, that's why it's okay to use a nuclear weapon, because they're less than us. And until we, as a society, come to grips with the fact that we're based on genocide and racism, until that happens, we're probably not going to come to grips with the implications of nuclear
And
weapons.
if you think about all the terms we've used for those others
Right.
throughout our history,
Right.
It's always, that puts them beyond the pale.
Right,
See, you can kill them,
Exactly, exactly,
but you can't kill other Americans.
right,
Well,
unless you're the president.
That goes way back in human history,
Yeah.
is to vilify, scapegoat, or whatever word you want to use, the other, that gives you the reason
Right.
to treat them less than human. You know,
Right.
oh, it's a dog, you know.
Well,
Right, the British did that to the Irish and to the Indians.
And if you might recall from your bayonet training,
Yeah.
those weren't
Right.
people, they were
No.
just
Yep,
others.
Yeah.
yeah,
And talking about the use of nuclear weapons, let's talk about the mechanics, because that's also part of it. Even if we don't want to, it can happen. So you talked about the president has the authority to launch a nuclear strike, and it's pretty much a unilateral authority.
right,
He's got the guy that follows him with the nuclear codes, and he can call them in and send that out to the bunkers, and await the missiles start flying. And then you don't, the Russians wouldn't have much time. And we've also seen that, is there any real control on this?
No, and-
supposedly the president controls it.
yeah, but if you look at our current president, He's such an erratic, reactive person that it's even more dangerous currently because he appears to be so thin-skinned that he's going to react to certain situations without thinking. And if you've got someone with the power of nuclear weapons who's reactionary but not thinking about it, the danger, that's why one of the reasons the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists now talk about 2 minutes and 30 seconds till midnight, whereas at one point in our history it was back to, I think, 17 minutes.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
But they just reduced it from 3 minutes to 2 minutes and 30 seconds in January of this year.
Exactly.
Well, if you recall, I think it was during the campaign or maybe after the election, Donald Trump said, well, why don't we use them? Why can't we use them?
And clearly had no understanding of what he was saying. Yeah.
And then during one of the debates, he didn't understand the nuclear triad. So he's not really familiar with this or some of the doctrines or why.
Right.
And he just looks at it as another,
Right.
You have rifles, you have nukes.
Right. Exactly.
And I think, thinking of it at this level of the president's power and the possibilities there, but you got to look at the whole chain of command. That's what this Eric Schlosser film and document does. There's been accidents in the past. There was one threat where the computer had the wrong program and they thought it was going to be an attack and they caught it in time. But since the Cold War, my understanding is that it's gotten tighter within the United States, but in Russia, they don't have as many checks
Right.
in the command and control between incident stop possibility and the decision to use. So that's touchy, and we don't know much about it. But on both sides, there's incidents in history where it's a human situation. Things break down, and even the best break down, and so we're in a thing. And we haven't mentioned here also the fact that since the Cold War, we have not cut off the hair trigger possibility. We haven't taken the nuclear weapons that we have installed off, what do they call it?
Hair trigger.
Hair trigger.
15 minutes.
Off high
yeah,
alert.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. It's on both sides, in Russia and in the United States.
now, theoretically, there were some right after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but that has changed.
No.
No, I think they reduced some,
Yeah.
but like we say, there's 1,300 at all of the nukes on the Trident submarines are hair
Right.
trigger alert.
And Russia has like just under 2,000. We have 1,700,
Right.
so that's plenty to do quite a bit of damage.
And you were talking about something triggered a thought with me in terms of technology. I've read that the computer system that controls the nukes in this country is still run on an 8-inch floppy disk. They haven't updated the computer system.
I think I've read that also.
Yeah, I mean, what does that mean? That's
Maybe they figure that no one can hack a floppy disk.
That's a good question.
It's just
I don't know.
how safe is that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we do have that issue that something could go wrong. I mean, signals could be misinterpreted.
Right.
So, and we have a president who seems to think that, well, we should be using it. And he had said, I think earlier on, during the campaign, we need to keep building nukes until we figure this out, something along those lines.
Yeah.
It would seem the logic would be we need to control it until we can figure it out and get rid of them.
Yeah. But that's a rational approach.
Right. And then in terms of, so we have, you have these problems. People aren't really aware of it, or if they are aware, they don't want to do it. So what does a concerned citizen do? I mean, like you mentioned, Ground Zero provides a lot of information.
Yeah, there's a tremendous amount, and this book has about 3 pages of practical things to do, but there's some organizations around town and across the world that people are choosing. I mentioned Ground Zero. We've been there 40 years practically, and doing stuff. We're just raising the flag, trying to say wake up. But there's
you're involved in that the new organization here in Washington
Oh,
State.
the Washington Coalition Against Nuclear Weapons, and that's one other area that's being sponsored by the Washington Physicians for Social Responsibility. And again, I think it's part of a nationwide effort, but the coalition here, they're trying to get communities in various communities, get groups within each various communities to start raising awareness, bringing people in to understand, get educated, and also making a point to the members of Congress that this is a concern, that people do want to change. We've had 2 meetings in Olympia so far. There's be a 3rd one coming up in July. Information, you can get that at, from WPSR.org. And then there's also, I think, the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation, which is Olympia, I've forgotten their
OlympiaFOR.org.
Yeah, OlympiaFOR.org is is organizing this, so you can go there and get information about when that would be. But there should be another meeting in July. The most recent meeting they held, they talked about an outreach committee, which is trying to get people to talk outside of their areas of comfort. We want to go talk, to groups that we don't normally talk to, because half the time we're talking, or maybe most of the time, we're talking to people that already know this. So we want to, and it's clear, if you start thinking about it, most people don't want to die in a nuclear war. They don't want to see the Earth poisoned with a nuclear winter. So how do we bring that to their attention? And that's what this coalition is trying to do.
So that's local. There's local things. The ACLU does things, and the Friends Service Committee does things, and there's and that's national and so forth. But I think we need to be aware that there's an international effort, and there's a group in the UN of nations, 123 nations, moving the UN to develop a treaty, because they're tired of waiting for the nuclear halves to get action. So they're working on a treaty which in July of this year will be developed and okayed, and then there's a lot of effort that will be needed to make the treaty active. Just because they have a draft statement of a treaty is not adequate. Each nation needs to take lead on it. So 120 some nations are saying to us and other nuclear countries, start abolishing nuclear weapons, start working to do that.
And this is based following the principle of the ban on landmines, the ban on weapons of chemical weapons, just saying this is not acceptable. This is not an acceptable national policy.
Right.
In addition, the Washington Coalition is pressing our senators, particularly Senator Cantwell, to support the bill that was introduced in Congress. It's called the, I think, Lew Markley bill. It's S-200, and that says the president cannot launch a first strike on his own without congressional approval. So that's moving through Congress. So far, we haven't heard back from Senator Cantwell or not, but again, the idea is to make phone calls and let her know that we as citizens, as Washingtonians, are concerned about this and we want her to take action. Efforts have been made with Representative Heck, who is not willing to co-sponsor the bill in the House. So again, maybe we need to make it clear to them that this is the case. So we're getting close to the end here. We've talked about civil resistance, and I guess to start to wrap up, do you think it makes any difference? I mean, should seems like
yeah, I think it does. Even Howard Zinn once said that if you go out and you do an action, a public action related to something, even if you don't see any real response to it, the victory is that you went and did it. And Dorothy Day used to say, we're here to do the work, we're not necessarily here to see the results.
Right.
So you have to want to do this for your own reasons. You have to be convinced that there's a reason to do it, even if you don't see the results.
Right.
But yeah, I think there's
And Bernie?
reason to do
Well,
it.
one of my experiences, probably the most in my face, is I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, which is right down the road from Kent State University in Ohio. And I was part of the anti-Vietnam War situation. I went to the 40th anniversary of the shootings at Kent State, where 4 students got killed and 13 injured. And they remembered, the local people had a remembrance, and they said, our anti-Vietnam War thing stopped President Nixon from using nuclear weapons in Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
He was considering doing it. And there was a time when one of his assistants came in and says, we can't do it because of the anti-war movement. So that's what he's saying. That's
William
what
Perry.
William Perry, the former Secretary of Defense, is saying. It's up to the people. If we don't have that, he's...
So even though you're not seeing the end of nuclear weapons, you've seen a restraint, you've seen some
Yes.
kind of control. So that's
Yeah.
that's all moving in that direction to make it less legitimate.
Just we're seeing people becoming educated again.
And I think
like they were in the
that's the
80s.
whole point, and one of the reasons why we're doing the show.
Right.
And we're just about out of time, but I really want to thank you for taking the time to come here and talk about it, and thank you for your service to your country.
Thank you for having us.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, well, so the Veterans for Peace mission statement prominently calls for reducing and eventually eliminating nuclear weapons. An important part of that mission is educating the public about the dangers that nuclear weapons pose to life on this planet. Equally important is informing people about what they can do to change our nation's nuclear policies. So, please share this information and join with members of your community to put an end to nuclear weapons and the nuclear arms race. The task requires persistence. As Noam Chomsky said, if you go to one demonstration and then go home, that's something. But the people in power can live with that. What they can't live with is sustained pressure that keeps building, organizations that keep doing things, people that keep learning lessons from the last time and doing it better the next time. Thank you for watching.
Soldiers speak out.